Have you ever met an HOA Karen? Someone who thinks she has control over everything, makes unreasonable rules, issues tickets faster than a cop, and never takes responsibility when things get out of hand? Today's story is about Linda Hathaway, an HOA tyrant who controls an entire neighborhood. But when she blocks a fire truck and sets a farm on fire, she doesn't know she's just destroyed herself. Because the owner of the farm is the mayor of the town, and this time the power is no longer hers. Do you think people like Linda will pay the price? Do you want to see an HOA tyrant fall to the system they created? If so, sit back, relax, because this is the most perfect story of doom you will ever hear. Blocking a fire truck to save the neighborhood's image? Having your own house burned down right after? Finally being overthrown by the HOA and reaping the bitter fruit of your own system? Watch till the end, because trust me, this ending is worth every second. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any more crazy HOA stories. The wind howled across the vast fields, carrying with it the searing heat of the fire that was consuming every square inch of land. I stood frozen on the porch, staring into the distance where the red flames were rising from the barn behind Oak Ridge Farm. Thick black smoke billowed into the night sky, swirling like an angry storm. My heart was pounding and sweat was pouring down my face despite the cool evening air. I had lived here for nearly 30 years, building every inch of land, every cornfield that stretched to the horizon. This was not only my home, but also my family's legacy, the livelihood of dozens of workers in town. But right now, everything I had built was burning before my eyes. A strong wind blew by, carrying the acrid smell of smoke that made me cough. The flames roared like a hungry beast, licking at the wooden walls of the barn where I had stored more than 3 tons of hay and seeds for the upcoming planting season. The barn would explode in just a few minutes, and when that happened, I would lose everything. I quickly pulled out my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed the emergency number. The familiar voice of the Greenfield Fire Department came on the other end. My voice was urgent, almost a shout. "Big fire at Oak Ridge Farm. I need you here now. The barn could be destroyed at any moment." It took the operator only a second to respond. "We're on the way. Keep a safe distance." I hung up, threw the phone in my pocket, and rushed to the barn. The cows and horses inside were screaming in panic, pounding on the barn door with their hooves. I rushed in, unlatched the door, and yelled for them to run into the field. The animals were panicking and pushing each other away from the fire trap, but I knew that if the fire department didn't get there in time, I could lose not only the cattle but the entire southern part of the farm. The sky turned orange-red, no sign of night. Every blade of dry grass caught fire, small sparks swirling in the wind, falling onto the roof of the newly built barn just a few dozen meters away. I screamed in despair, running for the nearest hose, but knowing full well it would do nothing. I alone could not put out the fire, could not stop this nightmare. In the distance, above the roar of the wind and the crackling of burning wood, I heard the siren of a fire truck echoing through the winding streets of Greenfield, echoing against the red sky. I felt a glimmer of hope in my chest, as if I had just grasped a lifeline in the midst of a raging river. But the greatest danger I had ever seen was coming. Instead of seeing the red and blue flashing lights reflecting off my white picket fence, I saw something else. An unbelievable obstacle. Right in front of the main entrance to the farm, in the middle of the small asphalt road leading to my barn, a shiny white Lexus was parked, not moving even as the siren blared behind it. I frowned, took off my heels, and ran to the main gate, holding onto the fence, my heart pounding as if I had just run out of a fight. Standing in front of the car, blocking the entrance, was Linda Hathaway, the woman Rosewood Meadows loved to hate. With perfect blonde hair and dressed in a white shirt and immaculate blue jeans, she stood there, arms crossed over her chest, eyes narrowed with arrogance. Even though I was a few feet away, I could hear her high-pitched, commanding voice. "This is an HOA neighborhood. Your cars are not allowed in." Fire Chief Mark Reynolds, a tall man whose face was familiar with the fires in town, jumped out of the truck, his eyes flashing with impatience. But Linda wouldn't let anyone interrupt. She jerked her chin, her voice filled with exasperation, as if the fire truck was the problem. "How many times have I told you fire trucks can't go through this neighborhood? They're unsightly. Our HOA has a code of conduct. They're too big, too loud. If there's a fire in the neighborhood, you'll have to take a detour." I stood there stunned. Smoke was still billowing from my farm, black columns that signaled the collapse of everything I'd built. "What the hell are you doing? My farm's on fire," I yelled, my voice hoarse from the smoke. "It's my farm on fire." Linda didn't turn her head, didn't look at me for a second. She continued arguing with the fire chief, her voice eerily calm, as if no one had just shouted for help. "You can take the north road, come in through the back gate. I don't accept emergency vehicles through the main entrance to this community." Behind her, Mark Reynolds clenched his fists. I could see his teeth clenched, his eyes flashing with anger, but he tried to keep his cool. An experienced fireman couldn't lose control, even in the face of a crazy woman like Linda. The only problem was that the detour would take at least 5 minutes. 5 minutes. The fire had caught the wooden fence of the barn. My horses had escaped, but the cows and sheep were still trapped inside. If the fire engine didn't get there, I'd lose them, the barn, and maybe the main house. I saw Mark turn around, pulling his walkie-talkie from his belt, his voice strained as a string. "Switch to Plan B. Get water from the North Fire Station." I couldn't believe my ears. I stood there gripping the fence so hard my knuckles turned white, my eyes glued to the fire truck that was making a U-turn. Linda was still standing in front of her shiny white Lexus, arms folded, grinning like she had just won a great battle. "That's easier, huh?" My neighbors, who had been fined by the HOA for stupid things like planting the wrong color flowers or leaving their bikes in the yard, watched from a distance, their faces filled with horror, but no one dared to speak up. Linda was too used to power, too used to the feeling of being able to control everything with tickets and silly regulations. She didn't realize how far this had gone. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms until they hurt. Linda had just taken away my most precious moments, and if I lost the farm because of this, she would pay. I just didn't expect the karma to come sooner than I thought. All I could do was grit my teeth and bear it, letting the seconds tick away, each second that could have cost a cow, a bale of hay, or worse, my entire farm. But then, the wind changed direction. A gust of wind swept through, carrying crimson ash from my farm, straight toward the residential area. I saw it before anyone else did. A small, dangerous piece of charred wood, lifted into the air by the wind, floating for a few seconds before landing in Linda's greenhouse. In a flash, a thin line of fire flared up among the rare flowers she always bragged about at HOA meetings. The expensive imported orchids and roses were all licked by the fire as if they had been dipped in oil. I heard a small crackle, then a loud pop, the glass exploding as the heat intensified, pieces falling to the ground, igniting the bags of organic fertilizer she had stored in the greenhouse. The flames leaped like a fiery snake, coiling around the wooden frame of the greenhouse and spreading quickly to the Japanese garden next door. The carefully tended bonsai trees, the imported Japanese stone statues, all were engulfed in a brilliant orange glow of fire. And then A scream rang out. Linda, who had been standing there with a triumphant look on her face, turned around, her eyes wide with horror as she saw her most precious possession burning. She blinked, as if in disbelief, and then dashed toward the garden, her shaking hand pointing at the flames. Another explosion, this time from a high-pressure irrigation tank, caused the fire to spread even further. I could almost feel the moment Linda realized her mistake. She had blocked the fire trucks, delayed the rescue, and now her own possessions were being consumed by fire. People screamed throughout the neighborhood. People who had feared Linda's power now standing by and watching, no one coming to help. Everyone knew Linda was not the type to accept help, and perhaps for the first time in her life she knew what it was like to be helpless. I looked at Mark Reynolds. The fire chief no longer looked as tense as before. He just stood there, quietly observing the scene before him, as if waiting for Linda to truly understand the consequences of her action. I stood there, watching Linda Hathaway collapse. The proud woman who had once blocked my fire truck was now trembling, her mouth stammering nonsense, her eyes fixed on the flames that were consuming her precious possessions. The greenhouse had collapsed, the entire wooden frame now reduced to red-hot coals, ash swirling in the night wind. But what made her panic the most was not the greenhouse, not the Japanese garden with its expensive imported stone statues, but the fire that had spread to the roof of the main house. Linda staggered back, her face as white as a sheet as she stared at the fire department with eyes full of despair and panic. In less than 10 minutes, the world she had carefully maintained with rigid rules, harsh laws, and the power she had once held so tightly was crumbling before her eyes. I had seen that look before, the look of someone who had just realized that everything they had built could be destroyed in the blink of an eye. No more moralizing, no more raised eyebrows at HOA meetings, just a woman out of control. She took a shaky breath, turned back to the fire department, her eyes glistening as she clutched the gold necklace she always wore as a symbol of power. And then she said something I couldn't believe, but it was too late. I saw her stagger toward the fire department where Mark Reynolds and his crew stood as still as statues. "Do something! Save my house!" No one rushed in. No one rushed to deploy the hoses like they had at my farm. No one reacted immediately. They just stood there waiting. And then Mark Reynolds spoke, as calmly as if he were talking about the weather. "I thought you didn't allow fire trucks in this neighborhood." Linda froze. I saw her face twitch, her lips part, but no words of defense came out. She knew, and everyone knew, that just 5 minutes ago she had been standing in front of the fire truck, confidently declaring that it wasn't allowed in the neighborhood, and now she was the one begging them to break the HOA rules to save her house. I could hear her phone fall to the tile floor, clattering helplessly against the stone. I saw her hands tighten around the hem of her skirt, as if clinging to the fabric might help her regain control. But this time, no ticket would save her from this nightmare. She took a deep breath, her eyes darting frantically to the neighbors she had bullied for years. They stood there, some holding their phones to record the scene, some staring with their arms crossed, no one making a move to help. Linda had done this to them too many times. Now they just stood by as she brought it upon herself. Flames engulfed the porch, a window exploded, and Linda finally collapsed. "Please, I beg you!" That plea could have been heard in the minds of all the residents here, those who had stood behind the closed doors of the HOA, who had begged Linda to ease her unreasonable rules, who had been tormented by her. But now there was only one person to beg, and it was her. Mark stared at her for a few seconds before pulling out his walkie-talkie. I had imagined Linda losing her power, but I had never thought it would come so quickly and so brutally. Linda stood there, trembling as her pleas fell on deaf ears. The fire continued to consume every corner of her house, the orange light reflecting off her pale skin, turning her once proud eyes into pits of despair. There was no one to help, no one to listen, no HOA to protect her from the very rules she had imposed. I couldn't take my eyes off the scene before me. Heat came in waves, carrying with it the smell of burning wood and melted plastic. Part of Linda's roof collapsed, making her scream, backing away as if she couldn't believe it anymore. But all she could do was watch. There was no power to save her now. Unable to contain myself any longer, I took a step forward, slowly pulling the dusty cap off my head. A hush fell over me, eyes turning to me, and I could feel the shock that ran through the crowd as they recognized who I was. Linda turned sharply, her eyes flickering to me for a moment, then suddenly hardening. I saw the shock on her face as her mind finally put the pieces together. This was not James Carter, the simple rancher she had despised. This was Mayor James Carter, the man she had just publicly defied, blocked fire trucks, ignored calls for help, and now stood before her, silently watching her fall. I could feel the sheer panic wash over her like a cold wave. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I saw her fingers tighten around the hem of her skirt as if she were clinging to a last shred of power, but it had evaporated like dust in the air. No one bowed to her anymore. No HOA to shield her. No more petty HOA tickets she could fling out to control everyone. She was no longer the one in power, but a helpless woman watching as her property burned to the ground. I didn't have to say anything. The silence between us said it all. Linda blinked repeatedly, as if trying to wake herself from a nightmare, but this wasn't a nightmare. This was reality, a reality she had created, a reality where she thought she could exert power over everyone, only to realize that she had just confronted the real power. The neighbors around her stood there, some gaping, some staring at Linda in disbelief. For years she had used her position as HOA president to threaten, blackmail, and fine anyone who didn't follow her unreasonable rules. And now she had done the worst thing in her life. She had gone up against the mayor. I could see the thought slowly taking over Linda. She took a breath as if she were about to say something, to excuse, to plead, to deny the reality. But no words left her lips, because she knew, everyone knew, and most importantly I knew, there was nothing that could be fixed. Linda Hathaway had lost everything, right now. The night wind still carried the smell of smoke and ashes, and the fire continued to consume what remained of the garden and greenhouse. But I could see clearly that what was consuming Linda was not just the physical fire, but also the thing she had clung to for so many years: power. I didn't need to say anything more. My identity was enough to end this battle. Linda had gotten herself into an irreparable situation, and now everything she had ever controlled was turning against her. The people stood around, silently watching it all. No one came to help. No one reached out to pull Linda out of this nightmare, because they remembered. They remembered the times she had fined them unreasonably, the times they had received warnings for a chair in the wrong place or a fence that was the wrong color. And now, for the first time in years, they were witnessing Linda being crushed by that very rule. Just hours after the fire, the HOA board called an emergency meeting in front of the ruins that Linda had once called home. No one objected when Linda Hathaway's name was removed from the HOA leadership list. No one spoke up to defend her. The very people who had once stood under her, the people who had always followed orders, now voted to remove her without hesitation. Linda no longer tried to fight back, no longer screamed or barked orders as she had before. She simply stood there, her hands hanging down, her eyes empty, as the HOA announced that she was no longer president. There were no more tickets to wave, no more power to threaten her neighbors. There was only a woman completely out of control, experiencing for the first time what it was like to not be able to control things the way she wanted. But that was not the final blow. A day later, the insurance company sent an official notice. They refused to cover Linda's burned-down house. I didn't need to see her reaction to know how painful it was. For someone like Linda, who has spent her life controlling, making rules, and forcing others to follow them, there's nothing worse than having the rules slapped back at her. The reason for the denial was simple. She had broken the law by deliberately obstructing emergency services, and according to the insurance contract, any damage caused by the owner's intentional actions would not be covered. In other words, Linda had burned down her own property. I imagined her opening the letter, the words dancing before her eyes, plunging her last hope into a hopeless despair. I wasn't there to see it, but I knew exactly how painful it would be, because this was what she had done to others. And now she was a victim of the system she had created. Linda lost everything overnight. But I knew this wasn't the end of her. The real downfall was still ahead. I had never seen the air in the town of Greenfield so light, something invisible but heavy, something that had weighed down all the residents here for years, had finally disappeared, along with Linda Hathaway's power. And, as is human nature when people are freed from oppression, they celebrated not with empty words, but with a real party. An event that Linda herself would have hated if she were still in power. Just 2 days after Linda was voted out of the HOA, the entire Rosewood Meadows community seemed to have come together to organize a BBQ, and the location they chose was none other than the empty yard right in front of the ruins of Linda's house. A giant banner hung between 2 streetlights. "We are finally flowers." I walked into the crowd smelling the sizzling of grilled meat on the grill, and the sound of laughter and chatter was everywhere. People moved freely between the grills. No one worried about unreasonable rules or HOA tickets anymore. I saw Mr. Patel, who Linda had once fined for leaving his trash can in the yard too long, happily grilling, flipping ribs, and laughing as he looked like he hadn't felt so free in years. Children ran freely on the sidewalks, laughing as they painted the pavement with bright pastels, something Linda had once banned because it affected the general aesthetic. A group of people gathered around what had once been Linda's Japanese garden, now a pile of ashes and charred stone statues, raising their beer glasses high in a farewell ritual. And right in the middle of it all, the Greenfield Fire Department walked in, their uniforms still smelling of smoke from the recent fire. The crowd immediately erupted in applause, people flocking to them as if they were the true heroes of the town, and given everything that had happened, they truly deserved it. Mark Reynolds shook my hand, smiling a lot more freely than he had in the tense days before. A plate of ribs was shoved into his hand, and when he took his first bite, the crowd laughed as if it were a historic sight, a fire chief finally enjoying a proper meal after days of battling the blaze and the HOA's unreasonable obstruction. But there was one person who wasn't there. Linda Hathaway. She wasn't there to witness the scene, but I knew she couldn't have missed it. The music was loud, the laughter echoed through the street. She had once controlled down to the last detail. The things she had once banned from noise, children playing, public BBQs, were now happening right in front of the ashes of her house. Linda was no longer there. She had left quietly that morning, no one to say goodbye, no one to greet her. I heard she had sold her house for a pittance, leaving her no choice but to leave Greenfield in disgrace. No one remembered her as someone who had power, but as someone who had tried to impose control over everything, only to destroy it all with her own hands. And as I raised my beer, amidst the excitement of the party, I knew that Greenfield had entered a new era. An era without HOA Linda. The celebration lasted late into the night, but none of us minded. Greenfield had never felt so free. No more ridiculous tickets, no more tense HOA meetings, no more tedious rules that strangled daily life. When I looked around, I saw a town that had come to life again, and though Linda Hathaway was no longer here, her legacy lingered, this time in the form of a hard lesson. I knew Linda couldn't bear to be erased from the place she once ruled. Someone like her couldn't just disappear into silence, but she couldn't stay without anything to hold on to. She left Greenfield early in the morning, just as the sky was tinged with dawn. There was no farewell party, no one to see her off, just a pickup truck carrying the remains of the fire. I didn't need to see her go in disgrace. Rumor has it that Linda found a new home in another neighborhood, in Arizona, where she could start over, where no one would know she was an HOA tyrant. But I knew her nature too well. Someone like Linda could never truly change. She could move, she could rebuild her life, but her controlling ways, her arrogance, her hunger for power could never be erased, and I knew karma doesn't let go that easily. I wasn't there when it happened, but I could picture the moment clearly, as if I had seen it with my own eyes. Linda walked out of her new home that first morning, taking a deep breath, trying to swallow the bitterness of leaving behind everything she had ever owned in Greenfield. But before she could enjoy the feeling of starting over, she saw a note stuck to the mailbox, HOA letter. I didn't need to see it to know what was inside. It was short, concise, and cruel in the way only HOAs can be. HOA violation. Your mailbox is not the correct color. I could imagine Linda standing there, her eyes wide, her hands clenching the paper until it was wrinkled, and then suddenly screaming in despair, a scream that no one cared about, a scream that disappeared into the wind, as if the universe were laughing at her. It was the perfect ending she could have gotten, not a total failure, not a tragic collapse, but a repetition of the same things she had done. Linda Hathaway had used her power to punish the smallest things, to force people into unreasonable rules that only she understood, and now she couldn't escape the trap she had created. I didn't need to see her again to know what would happen next. She could argue with the new HOA, she could file a complaint, she could try to maneuver around it the way she had always done. But I knew better than anyone that she couldn't win this fight, because this time she wasn't the one in power. This time she was just a regular citizen, trapped in the system she had once controlled. And this time no one was on her side. Linda Hathaway thought she had it all. As HOA president, she had ordered, fined, and imposed unreasonable rules on the entire neighborhood. But like a game of chess, she had made a wrong move, and this time she couldn't turn back. Block the fire truck? Her own house was on fire. Made her own rules? Those rules came back to bite her. Use the HOA to control others? The HOA fired her without mercy. What do you think? If there was an HOA Karen like Linda in your neighborhood, what would you do? Have you ever met an HOA Karen like Linda? Tell me in the comments. And if you loved this perfect debacle, wait until I tell you about the HOA who sued her neighbors for planting the wrong type of grass. Don't miss it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because I have many more top-notch HOA drama stories waiting for you.